Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our symposium on religious practices, transmission, and literacies in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Today, we have what promises to be a very interesting presentation by Professor Heather Sharkey. But first, a few words about the section, about our division. A few words about our division, the obligatory plug. Our division is divided into 3 sections. The African section, which deals with sub-Saharan Africa, the Near East section, which deals with everything from Kazan in the north to Khartoum in the south, Kashgar in the east to Casablanca in the west, and the Hebraic section, which deals with Hebraica and Judaica worldwide. Today, we would like to welcome our speaker, Professor Heather Sharkey. Professor Heather Sharkey is professor and chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches Middle Eastern and North African history, and where she received the Charles Ludwig Distinguished and Teaching Award from the College of Arts and Sciences. She previously taught at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and Trinity College in Connecticut. She was visiting professor at the École d'Études en Sciences Sociales, the EHESS, in Paris during the 2012 to 13 year. She holds degrees from Yale in Anthropology, the University of Durham in Middle Eastern Studies, and Princeton, her PhD in history. She has won fellowships, including the Marshall, Fulbright-Hays, and Carnegie. She is the author of Living with Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, University of California Press, American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire, and A History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East. She has edited Cultural Conversations, Unexpected Consequences of Christian Missionary Encounters in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia with Mehmet Ali Dohan. American Missionaries in the Modern Middle East, Foundational Encounters, and with Jeffrey Edward Green, and The Changing of Religious Freedom, The Changing Terrain of Religious Freedom. And now, without further ado, Professor Heather Sharkey.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that introduction. It's an honor to be here today. I'm going to share my screen now, and I have some slides to show you while I talk. Again, I'm really delighted to be here, so thank you. The Library of Congress holds cookbooks from all over the world, written in dozens of languages. Many focus on cuisines and foodways of the Middle East and North Africa, and come from authors who were born in the region or whose parents or grandparents came from there. In late May and early June in 2022, I visited the Library of Congress as a guest of the African and Middle Eastern Division to participate in this project on national religious literacy. My talk builds on research that I conducted during my residency when I consulted dozens of cookbooks in English and Arabic, along with a few in French and German, from the 20th and early 21st centuries. My goal today is to suggest how Middle Eastern and North African cookbooks can promote religious literacy, meaning an awareness of and respect for distinctions and commonalities rooted in religious cultures and social values. On the one hand, cookbooks often cast light on Muslim, Christian, and Jewish particularities by linking foods to holidays and dietary practices, including fasting. On the other hand, many transcend religious differences while emphasizing universal values such as love for family and the importance of sharing food with others. We can understand these values, I suggest, through the concept of commensality, which means sitting and eating at the same table, with implications for mutual appreciation and respect. Here is my plan. I will start by addressing the questions, why study cookbooks and Middle Eastern and North African cookbooks especially? I will next describe types of cookbooks according to themes that they cover to show their diversity. I will then consider how cookbooks connect food to religious practices and how they model values of sharing. Moving to the level of recipes, and before quickly concluding, I will highlight two dishes that illustrate Middle Eastern and North African social values. So why cookbooks? For historians, anthropologists, and other scholars, cookbooks offer rich insights. They suggest what people have eaten or what they would have liked to eat. Cookbooks, as one food historian has observed, are often aspirational. The arrangement of recipes can yield insights too. For example, a cookbook may have sections devoted to breakfast foods, snacks, or holiday favorites. Such categorizations, typically set out in chapters, convey assumptions about when people should eat certain things and how meals should order days and seasons. Cookbooks can also tell us about things like agricultural resources, what grows where, technologies for food preservation and preparation. For example, did people have refrigerators? And if they did not, then how did that affect what they ate? Labor, think about the work involved in procuring, cooking, and serving food. And long distance trade, consider access to spices like cinnamon, which came from far away. Cookbooks can also illuminate customs, for example, by featuring festive foods, such as date-filled shortbread cookies for Easter or for Ramadan nights, or flourless nut cakes for Passover. The Middle East and North Africa is an especially important place to study from the perspective of food. Millennia ago, the Fertile Crescent became a cradle for agricultural development, the birthplace of founder crops such as wheat, barley, and lentils. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century and the expansion of the First Islamic Empire, the region became a hub for the global diffusion of crops like sugarcane, which allowed for the proliferation of sweets and what we now call desserts. From roughly the 17th century onward, the region popularized and spread coffee, and with it, the social institution of the neighborhood cafe, via routes that started in Ethiopia and went through Yemen. The region also helped to circulate New World foods like chili peppers, tomatoes, and potatoes as they traveled eastward from the Americas through Europe and further into Asia and Africa. From the vantage point of food studies, the Middle East and North Africa region has played major roles in world history. The region has also been supremely important for cookbooks as a literary form. 1,000 years ago, in cities like Cairo and Baghdad, elite men who often had ties to palaces and courts began to write Arabic cookbooks, some of which doubled as dietary manuals containing advice on what to eat to maintain or restore good health. As one scholar put it, the region ended up producing the richest medieval food literature in the world, so that there are more cookbooks in Arabic from before 1400 than in the rest of the world's languages put together. In the 20th century, cookbooks became an increasingly popular medium and became cheap to print and buy. My research starts here, with cookbooks published from about the 1950s onwards. Whether in English or Arabic, these modern cookbooks attest to the expansion of female education, for in fact, women started to predominate as cookbook authors. 20th century cookbooks, whether written by women or men, often appeal to women as assumed readers, reflecting social realities of who was working in home kitchens. Many of the English language cookbooks in the Library of Congress attest to histories of migration that have brought Middle Eastern and North African people to the United States from the late 19th century onward. Authors have frequently identified themselves as immigrants or as the descendants of immigrants, and as grandparents, children, or grandchildren, giving their cookbooks a strong generational consciousness. Many have expressed clear intentions for their cookbooks, such as a desire to preserve familial and cultural traditions, to raise funds through book sales for scholarships and other charities, and to promote peaceful relations amid regional conflicts. Others have aimed to survey culinary traditions within and across ethnic, national, and religious or sectarian lines. Some consciously and purposely cross national and communal borders. Many have described their efforts to record recipes in terms of archiving and preserving heritage. I was struck by how one Yemeni author used the Arabic verb arha to describe what she did, using the verb for writing down history, a verb related to the word for tarikh, history itself. Cookbooks often convey what some scholars call culinary nostalgia, the acute missing of a distant homeland or earlier time, and describe a race to save traditions before assimilation, the death of loved ones, or lifestyle changes obliterate them. Dozens of cookbooks that I saw stressed the economical nature of Middle Eastern and North African food. Whether written from the 1960s, in the 1960s, or during the last 5 years, cookbooks repeatedly praised the ability of cooks to stretch recipes from these cuisines and to feed people in thrifty yet still lavish ways, notably by using beans and lentils along with common vegetables like cabbage and others, while limiting meat. One Palestinian cookbook author summed it up when he observed that when he was a child, his family and his neighbors, whether Muslim, Jewish, or Christian, were almost vegetarians on the grounds of financial necessity. Pride in cuisines that are at once delicious, healthy, potentially cheap, and above all, shareable, surfaced repeatedly in the books that I saw. The variety of Middle Eastern and North African cookbooks in the Library of Congress is stunning. And while I was there, I found myself making a list of types or subgenres as I was reading them, with many cookbooks fitting into more than one of the categories that I devised. I saw cookbooks that featured a number of things. I'm going to show you some slides, some of book covers and some snapshots that I took while I was there. So some cookbooks feature national cuisines, either a survey of the food of one country or a volume specializing in one part of the cuisine, such as I found, for instance, a book of Algerian pastries. This is a funny example I have up now. It's a book of Kuwaiti cuisine, Kuwaiti food. And the photograph there is a picture of eggplant dip shaped like the Kuwaiti flag with garnishes and beans on the side. What I would also like to point out on the right-hand side, you could see that the author of this particular cookbook donated it to the Library of Congress directly. I found many cookbooks specializing in specific religious, sectarian, or ethnic communities, such as this book you see in the main reading room of Sephardic Jewish cooking, centered primarily on Spain, Andalusia, and Morocco, and using recipes, many of them coming from before the 15th century, and works devoted to the food of particular Christian communities, such as the one on the right from a Chaldean Catholic community in Michigan. I found books that covered food or used food as a means of addressing issues related to interfaith harmony, social reconciliation, or cross-communal understanding, especially vis-a-vis Israeli and Palestinian relations. And what you see on the left is a bilingual Arabic and Hebrew cookbook written by a Muslim Palestinian woman and featuring the cuisine of one town, Jaffa, which is outside Tel Aviv. I found books associated with religious history and with ancient and medieval Judaic, Christian, and Islamic tradition, such as recipes inspired by the Bible, or as in this example you see now, by the poems of Rumi, the 13th century Muslim Sufi visionary. I found many cookbooks that featured Middle Eastern and North African restaurants. And in fact, this is a growing trend. I have 3 examples up here. Zahav, an Israeli restaurant in Philadelphia, which is where I live. And you see another restaurant that I used to go to when I was a student in Cairo, and they now have a cookbook as well. And then on the right is a recent Afghan cookbook from Australia, based on a restaurant there. I also found a couple of fascinating books that were part of domestic science curricula in schools. So these are cookbooks that were textbooks, and the examples on the screen here are from Egypt and Sudan. I found many books that celebrated Middle Eastern cuisine as a route to good health. And this is a funny one I found, A Belly Dancer's Slim Down and Shape Up Secrets, published in 1979. Then too, there are cookbooks that function as an adjunct to tourism, presented in lavishly photographed coffee table book formats, which I would suggest are often more for looking than for cooking. The recipes are often quite elaborate, but the beautiful photographs mean that it's a pleasure to leaf through them. There is also a growing number of cookbooks that feature a single ingredient. And I have 2 examples on the screen. I own both of these books, the yogurt cookbook and a more recent one about date palm syrup, which is really beautiful to read. This yogurt cookbook got me started. I brought a show and tell, making my own yogurt, because after reading it, I felt inspired, and I've been making my own for the past 3 years. There are also cookbooks that use food for social and political advocacy by raising awareness about displaced people and survivors of war. And here are 2 excellent examples on the screen. And finally, I found many, many books that use food as a way of remembering or honoring family and preserving traditions. And these are examples here of Palestinian, Armenian, Syrian, Sephardic, and Bahraini cultures. The cookbooks that can most effectively cultivate cultural and religious literacy are often the ones of this last type, which strive to honor family and preserve traditions. That is because writers with this goal often say more. They preface recipes with stories and anecdotes that give their books a memoir-like, ethnographic, or even history book quality. Focusing on family customs and on instructing future readers and cooks, they convey information about religious observances and communal customs, how families lived every day, marked special events, and mixed with neighbors. In English, the cookbooks of Claudia Roden, a giant in the field of Middle Eastern and North African food writing, stand out here, and so I propose to use them now as examples. Roden was born in 1936 to a Jewish family that had immigrated to Egypt a couple of generations earlier from Aleppo, Syria. Roden has written many cookbooks, but 2 have been especially influential. One is A Book of Middle Eastern Food, published in 1968, and in a revised edition in 2000. And another is The Book of Jewish Food, published in 1996, which the Jewish Women's Encyclopedia has called a Bible of Jewish cooking. Although the Book of Jewish Food surveys recipes from Jewish communities all over the world while covering Europe extensively, it begins and ends with the Middle East and North Africa, and with stories about Roden's family in Cairo. Writing in a straightforward way that both Jewish and non-Jewish readers can grasp, and here I'm referring especially to the Book of Jewish Food, Rodin explains Jewish dietary rules such as the avoidance of pork, which Muslims also shun. She discusses the Jewish calendar, the weekly Sabbath, and holidays like Passover, and then gives recipes that marked these occasions. She notes regional variations. Regarding Rosh Hashanah, for example, when Jews have often made sweet foods to augur a sweet new year, she explains that Moroccan Jews would often add sugar to spinach, zucchini, and other vegetable dishes, while Egyptian Jews would avoid using bitter and sour ingredients like lemon juice and tamarind. And again, these were adaptations for foods for the Rosh Hashanah holiday in particular. Rodin mentions popular beliefs that Muslims and Christians shared with Jews, such as the idea that 7 is a lucky number, which led people to make certain dishes with 7 ingredients for good luck. She gives recipes for casseroles that people slow cooked unattended in ovens on Friday night so that they could respect the rest of Sabbath the next day. Reading Rodin's cookbooks, one can learn a lot about Jewish holidays and practices, but also about connections among Muslims, Jews, and Christians more broadly. Now, of course, many of Rodin's cookbooks have been bestsellers issued by well-known publishers. By contrast, most of the cookbooks I saw in the Library of Congress were low-budget editions with small print runs, and some of them were things that very few libraries in the United States, if any, would have. While I do not have time to discuss cookbooks as material objects, I would like to point out that the nature of the various cookbooks, in terms of their format and paper quality, and whether they have illustrations and photographs or not, varies widely. Regardless of their relative fame or obscurity, though, and their relative glossiness or simplicity, many of the cookbooks I saw struck me as gold mines for cultural information. This was especially true, again, when they included stories with recipes or signaled foods common to wider communities, such as lentil soup in relation to Ramadan, Lenten, and Yom Kippur fasts. One of the most beautiful and touching cookbooks that I read during my residency at the Library of Congress was the work of 2 Syrian women named Itab Azam and Dina Musawi, who are both theater producers living in England. Azam and Musawi wrote that they took up pots and pans as their weapons to draw attention to the Syrian civil war and its toll while raising money for refugees. In stories attached to recipes, they often mentioned foods and attitudes towards food that Syrians shared across sectarian and religious lines. They wrote, for example, that bread is considered a sacred gift from God in the Arab world, whether you are a Muslim, Druze, or Christian, and it's a sin to waste it even after it has gone stale. That's one of the reasons why feta, literally breadcrumbs made from leftover pita chips, is such a popular dish. And here you can see a picture for that kind of recipe here. They expressed pride in how Syrians could make banquets from humble ingredients, describing meals like the one a refugee served them in London. And they included some recipes as memorials too, such as the favorite sandwich recipe from a friend's father who was struck and killed by a missile while standing at an ATM. In cookbook after cookbook, written across the years and from many different places, authors repeated certain core principles. A Guest to an Arab Home, declared a 1995 cookbook published by an Arab American Civic Association in Detroit, is always welcomed by ahlan wa sahlan, meaning you are amongst family. When grandmother reminded us of our duties to our guests, wrote an author from an Azerbaijani and Iranian family in 1960, she often quoted a famous Persian saying, which means a guest is God's gift. If you are the host, advised a 2010 cookbook from a Chaldean Catholic Iraqi American Women's Society in Michigan, remember to say fatalo, which means do me the honor. When guests visit a home in Syria, Lebanon, or Jordan, wrote an Armenian American author in 1999, they are immediately made to feel that their presence is a cause for happiness and celebration. When a host says, Beiti Beitik, my home is your home, he or she really means it. Some of the cookbooks, whether written in Arabic or English, began or ended with prayers, thanks to God, or quotations from the Bible or the Quran. Such passages may give the cookbooks an obviously religious character. But what really drives home the social ethics and religious impulses behind so many of these cookbooks, I would argue, is the emphasis that they place again on love for family and the imperative of sharing one's food. Moving now from the scale of the cookbook to the recipes within them, I would like to highlight dishes that exemplify the ethics of hospitality and generosity that tie together diverse communities of Middle Eastern and North African origin. And I have chosen two examples. The first example is a dish called mujadara, which comes from the Levant, that is, from what is now Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. Mujadara consists of grain, lentils, and caramelized onions, and can be served on big trays that are ideal for sharing. Historically, mujadara featured bulgur wheat, but in modern times, rice has become common too. Recipes for mujadara appear in several of the books that I consulted, and a book about medieval Arab cuisine mentioned it also. Christians have favored mujadara during Lent because it is vegan. And as two Syrian authors noted, the previous two that I mentioned, who wrote the book called Our Syria, Christians have favored it for Lent because it imparts a sense of humility as a food common to poor people and workers. Claudia Rodin noted that Jews often made mujadara for the Sabbath because it tastes good cold, which is to say it can be pre-made, and when served with yogurt, can be a dairy dish according to kosher rules that forbid mixing meat and milk. Muslims have always enjoyed mujadara simply because it is delicious and uses readily available ingredients. As one Palestinian Muslim author noted, mujadara was an everyday food when he was growing up. It was a staple, unlike meat. Mujadara embodies the notion, to adapt a proverb that one author cited, that a small house can have a big heart. It is the humble dish that can make a feast. The second example of a dish that I would like to highlight is called ashura. It is a sweet and nutritious soup, or a soup-like or porridge-like thing, which is also good hot or cold. Though somewhat less commonly eaten today than mujadara, it is also very historic. I found a luxurious recipe for this dish in the recent prize-winning cookbook called Feast, Food of the Islamic World, by Lebanese-British writer Anissa Halou. Her book features festive foods of Muslim communities across the Middle East and North Africa and further afield in places like Somalia and Zanzibar. Halou's version of this dish includes, and here's a long list, wheat berries like farro, chickpeas, cannellini beans, fava beans, rice, dried figs, dried apricots, raisins, butter, sugar, ground hazelnuts, walnuts, milk, rose water, and spices such as cinnamon and nigella seeds. In today's terms, we might call it a high-protein main dish and dessert rolled into one. Halou's ashura recipe jumped out at me when I saw it because during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, I attended a Zoom symposium sponsored by the German Research Institute in Istanbul, in which historians discussed this dish in different contexts. Halou writes that ashura is prepared on the feast day of Noah's escape from the flood, in the first month of the Muslim calendar. Those living in the countryside used to make it with what they had growing in their fields. City folks would buy their ingredients from the bazaar. But regardless, many also made this dish to commemorate the holiday of Ashura on the 10th day of Muharram, which is when the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Hussein ibn Ali, was martyred in the Battle of Karbala in Iraq in 680 CE. The anniversary of Hussein's death at Karbala is a somber holiday that Shia Muslims, not Sunni Muslims, tend to observe. But as I learned from the Istanbul Symposium, and you can see the announcement for that symposium here, this sweet soup was once common in Iran, as well as in the heartlands of the Ottoman Empire, among diverse Muslims, Christians, and Jews. In the 16th century, Ottoman sultans sometimes distributed it to guests as a sign of their munificence. They also gave it to travelers. Armenian Christians historically made it on festive occasions and called it Noah's Ark pudding, I suspect because it includes so many things. One speaker mentioned that Jews used to serve it after funerals. It was a comfort food for mourners. In other words, this dish was widespread, symbolically rich in various social and religious contexts, and healthy and comforting at once. Recipes for Ashura remind me of another soupy dessert, which I saw in various cookbooks that I consulted. One, written by an Arab-American woman in 1957, described a very similar, though simpler version, which she called Saint Barbara's Miracle. She wrote that Christian families made it to celebrate the birth of a baby. Ashura recalls another traditional dessert called khushaf. In the Library of Congress, I found a Sudanese Arabic home economics textbook published in Khartoum in 1973, which recommended chilled khushaf for breaking the fast of Ramadan because it is filling, hydrating, and restorative at the same time. So to conclude, Middle Eastern and North African cookbooks can enrich our cultural understanding and contribute to religious literacy by introducing us to distinctions and commonalities rooted in religious cultures and social values. We can think of these values in terms of commensality, a word that means being at the same table and eating together with implications for sociability and mutual esteem. Commensality is becoming a lively area of research among public health experts, as I realized when I came across a series of articles from last year, 2021, published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. In different case studies featured in this journal, teams of public health experts studied how eating together, as opposed to eating alone, affected individual and collective well-being and physical and emotional health. Thinking comparatively, as a historian interested in food and cookbooks, I believe that commensality may help us to appreciate what we could call civic health and the collective well-being of religiously pluralistic societies like what we find in the United States. I hope that I have convinced you of the value of cookbooks for academic study while showcasing one small part of the Library of Congress collections. The Library of Congress is a magnificent and tremendous scholarly resource, and I remain extremely grateful for having had the opportunity to explore what it holds. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sharkey, for a very, very fascinating presentation. I'm actually very interested in this avenue of using books as a means of studying history and culture. And you suggest that a number of scholars are doing this. Can you please elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think what's going on is that, this area of food studies in general is booming. More universities are starting to have programs on the subject. It's a subject that one can approach from many different angles. So just thinking in terms of Middle Eastern and North African studies, you can approach food studies from the point of view of literature, environmental impacts, health, nationalism. There are just so many ways of approaching it. So that's one reason why the area is becoming so vibrant. And then also it's really important for studying migration. And that's something that's becoming increasingly important as the people of Middle Eastern and North African origin and their descendants are growing in size as a community. People are becoming more interested in the culinary traditions that brought people together. So for a variety of reasons, it is a really thriving field for study. And cookbooks are a wonderful source for giving us insights into that process. And then too, by the way, we can track different kinds of changes over time, like changes in technology, access, what people have in their homes, access to trade and the global circulation of resources. And another thing to point out is that Middle Eastern and North African cultures are constantly evolving, and you can see that in cookbooks too. So one cookbook, for example, has quinoa recipes, and another has, Syrian-style tiramisu. So you see these changes and these changes and exchanges going on through food.
Well, so I'm wondering, as a scholar yourself and other scholars, how are cookbooks? I'm assuming that you use cookbooks in your classrooms, and I'm wondering how you would go about that. I mean, what is expected of the students that are required to read cookbooks?
So I started, well, first of all, two things started me out in this field of inquiry, and I began to develop a class on this at the University of Pennsylvania. One is that I'm an avid cook myself, and the other is that I found myself reading the scholarship on food and realizing how much there was. So I started by assigning translations of some of these historic cookbooks. Like I put one up in my PowerPoint, and I would have students read and think about it. And then what really happened is also during the pandemic, when at my institution, as at other institutions, we all had to be online, I realized people weren't able to come together. I used to bring food to my classes. I couldn't do that anymore. So I started assigning what I called an experiential learning assignment, where I got our institution to access certain cookbooks as ebooks, since our library was closed for a while, physically closed. And then I assigned students a set of cookbooks and told them they had to make something from it and bring it for a virtual buffet. And what I found is that it became an extremely meaningful experience for the students to have this hands-on multi-sensory learning experience. And then also realizing that even if we couldn't be together, we could have a kind of commensality online, even if it's not perfect. The experience has been so successful, and students have been so enthusiastic that they've asked me to incorporate more such assignments going forward. And I could talk more about how I do that and what I advise, because over time I've become more aware. I should also say most of my students do not have cooking experience, even basic experience, and they live in a world where they eat a lot of takeout and pre-prepared foods. So on a very broad level, I think I can help them to learn more about the Middle East and North Africa, to feel like it's an adventure, a learning adventure for them, and at the same time, give them another set of life skills that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Well, now that you've made us all hungry, I am gonna ask one last question. And you have me wondering now, like authors of these cookbooks, who is their target audience? I mean, I've always assumed that it was just people who would like to cook or learn recipes, but from what you're saying, it seems like it's a much more complex.
It is. I mean, I'm an avid cook. I look at cookbooks, and the ones I was looking at, I was reading them for insights and for stories and for thinking, oh, would I actually want to work with this one? But I have a colleague who told me he never cooks from cookbooks. He's an expert on cookbooks. He reads cookbooks. And it was while talking to him that I became more aware of how some people read cookbooks the way I read novels. And then too, you realize, again, there are different purposes. Sometimes these cookbooks are almost like cultural touchstones. So if you think about target audience, let's say there was one cookbook I found from the Arab American community in Michigan. There are a few like that. And it's like grandma's recipes. Well, are people actually cooking grandma's recipes? Not really, partly because tastes change. But they want to be able to see what grandma did. And it's that ability to look back and to be able to open a cookbook and say, that's the tradition that my family had. That ends up being meaningful. So for example, one of the slides I had up earlier from the Armenian Syrian cookbook by a grandmother, written down by her granddaughter, who explained that her grandmother didn't even know English after living in the United States for many years. She had a whole series of recipes for curing olives. I mean, who cures their own olives, right? And I'm pretty serious. I'm not going to cure my own olives. Where am I going to get them anyway? But I think that's important. And that's an example of how a cookbook can preserve information. And the information feels meaningful to people. So I guess what we should also then understand is that people turn to cookbooks for different reasons. And another one might be, let's say you go on a wonderful vacation to Morocco, and it was the journey of a lifetime. You get that Moroccan cookbook and you can flip through the pages and you're like, remember we had that wonderful tagine in Marrakesh? And it becomes meaningful, but you're not actually cooking from it. So again, cookbooks do many things, have many audiences, give lots of different kinds of information, and I believe that they are really valuable as sources, and I hope that the Library of Congress will continue to collect them.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sharkey, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. I don't know about everybody else, but I'm about to go get something to eat. With that, we would like to conclude this presentation, and we hope that you join us for the rest of the panels in this symposium. And for those of you who are interested in researching not just the Middle East, but any topic really, we invite you to come to the Library of Congress, and we are sure we can provide you with the sources that you need for your research. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.